Hey there. Tonight we're leaving behind the polished decks and daring duels of Hollywood and setting sail into the real world of pirates, where the grog was sour, the food was rotten, and glory was a myth sold by men who never smelled gunpowder. This is not a tale of treasure maps and swashbuckling romance. This is a tale of splinters, salt sores, and desperate men chasing survival across a rotting sea. So dim your lights, get comfortable, and let's drift into a world where the only real treasure was making it to the next shore alive. They called it the Artemis Wind, but the ship was more rot than wind by the time Elias boarded her. The hull creaked like an old man's knees, and the sails were patched with more prayers than canvas. Still, it floated, and that, in the pirate world, was the only qualification that mattered. Elias had no illusions. He didn't come chasing gold. He came because land had nothing left to give him. No job, no home, no bread, just a warrant with his name and a bounty too small to be taken seriously, except by men who were desperate for meat. The Artemis had 30 men and no captain. That had changed last week. The old one, a Spaniard with one eye and a mouth full of broken teeth, had been thrown overboard in the middle of a storm, not for mutiny, but for snoring. The new captain, Rook, was 25, red-haired, and rumored to have once eaten a man's ear just to settle a card game. "Keep your hands fast and your mouth shut," the cook told Elias on his first night, slapping a bowl of something gray into his hands. That's the only rule. The food was salt pork and beans when you were lucky, rat stew when you weren't, and always, ship's biscuit, so hard you could hammer nails with it. The biscuits came with weevils, but the men said they were extra protein and crunched them without blinking. Sleep came in hammocks strung elbow to elbow, every man smelling of tar, sweat, and something darker that no amount of sea air could wash away. Privacy was for kings. On the Artemis, you changed your shirt under a blanket or not at all. But what the movies never tell you is that boredom is a killer too. Days passed without sails on the horizon. No merchant ships, no Spanish galleons. Just sea, sun, and sickness. The men grew restless. Jokes turned sharp, fights broke out over dice, over cards, over the last spoonful of dried peas. Elias learned quickly, never turn your back, not even to piss. Then came the storm, not the usual squall, a black wall of wind and foam that fell from the sky like judgment. The sea rose up angry, and the Artemis answered by cracking at her seams. Buckets were handed out, not to bail water, but to hold onto when the ship tilted like a drunk. The mainmast split, the forward sail tore free, and the man in the crow's nest was never seen again. When it ended, 6 were dead, and Captain Rook had vanished, last seen laughing into the wind with his arms spread wide like wings. The survivors stood soaked, bruised, and silent on the deck, staring at the horizon. No one said the word curse, but they were pirates, and pirates didn't need to. The Artemis floated on, slower now, wounded, but not dead. Elias climbed into the empty crow's nest that night and stared at the stars. He had grown up hearing songs of pirate kings and hidden gold, but no one sang about the hunger, the rot, the smell of death behind every rope knot. Tomorrow, someone would call for a new captain, and if no one stepped forward, someone else would be thrown into the sea. Dawn broke over the Artemis like a bruise, purple and swollen, bleeding gold into the sky. The sea had gone eerily still, as if the storm had taken the wind with it, or left it behind in some other cursed corner of the world. Below deck, no one spoke of Rook. Not because they mourned him, but because his name felt heavy now. A man who laughed at death and vanished into a storm wasn't someone you remembered out loud, especially not when his boots were still sitting by the mast. The silence dragged into breakfast. If you could call a shared crust of hard biscuit and a cup of rainwater breakfast, men chewed in silence. One swatted a fly, another picked at a splinter in his thumb until it bled. Then someone said it. "We need a new captain." It came from Grady, the ship's quartermaster. A mountain of a man with a knife scar so deep across his face that one eye never shut fully. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Grady was the closest thing the Artemis had to a godfather. "We vote," he said. "No volunteers. You get named, you speak your case, and if we don't like what we hear," he let the pause settle like a threat. "Then the sea gets another officer." Elias didn't blink. He was too new. No one would name him. But that didn't mean he was safe. Votes on a pirate ship were blood sport. They weren't about honor. They were about survival. You named someone weak or arrogant or unlucky and hoped the rest agreed with you. Otherwise, your name might get tossed in out of spite. 3 names came up. Marin, the helmsman, clever, steady, but with a mouth that never stayed shut. Oric, the gunner, built like a barrel, missing 2 fingers from a powder flash. And Crane, the ship's surgeon, too thin, too quiet, and always staring at the horizon like he saw ghosts there. Crane declined before anyone could ask. "Don't want the wheel," he said simply. "Just want to patch the holes." The men chuckled nervously. That left Marin and Oric. Marin made his case with flair. "Storm didn't kill me. That's worth something," he said, tossing a coin and catching it without looking. "We've got enough powder for 1 broadside and enough biscuit to last 6 days. After that, it's rats and prayers. You want a captain who knows how to sail and steal. I'm your man." Oric stepped forward next. "No speeches," he said. "Just this." He unwrapped a soaked cloth from his belt and dropped it on the deck. Inside, a tiny pouch of black powder, bone dry. Saved it from the storm. Held it in my mouth. The crew murmured. Madness, maybe. But dedication. Grady looked at the crew. Votes? It was close. Too close. But Marin won, by 2 hands. Oric didn't speak, just nodded once and returned to the cannon bay. Later that night, Elias found himself summoned to the helm. Marin leaned against the rail, his boot on a coil of rope, wind tugging at his long, sea-wet hair. "You were a scribe, right?" Marin asked without looking. Elias hesitated. "A bookkeeper." "Same thing. Good with numbers?" "I can count." "Good. Count the rations." Quietly. "We've got 7 men who won't last the week, and I need to know how many I can afford to throw overboard." Elias didn't answer. He didn't need to. Because now he knew, nothing on this ship was done for show. Not anymore. Not now that the glamour was gone and the mask had slipped. There was no glory in piracy. Just men pretending not to starve. Below deck, the Artemis breathed like a dying beast. Each creak of the hull echoed through the cramped, wet belly of the ship. A groan of old timber warped by salt, soaked by years of blood and brine. The lanterns flickered low, their glow dimmed by grime and damp, casting shadows on every wall that moved when no man did. Elias sat cross-legged near the provisions, counting slowly. Biscuits, mold-rimmed and crawling with weevils. A half-keg of salted pork. 4 casks of water, though 2 already tasted more of copper than rain. Enough for 5 days if rationed. 3 if the sun stayed hot. Maybe 2 if anyone got bold with their portions. He scratched notes in the margin of an old prayer book, its psalms long since scrubbed out and replaced with tally marks. It was the only paper he had. "You always that quiet?" The voice came from the dark. Oric. He leaned against a beam, arms crossed, eyes half in shadow. He hadn't spoken to Elias since losing the vote, and Elias had hoped it would stay that way. "I count better when I'm not being watched," Elias said without looking up. "That's fair." Oric stepped forward. "But there's something I want you to count next." Elias glanced up. "What?" "Men." He tossed something down beside him, a half-bitten biscuit crawling with ants. "Start paying attention," Oric said. 3 days ago we had 30. This morning I counted 26. Marin's not asking questions and no one's swinging lanterns to look. Storm took 6. Storm took 4. Elias stared. "You think?" "I think someone's cutting weight early," Oric said. "And I think we've got ourselves a captain who smiles too easily when no one's looking." He left before Elias could answer. That night, the screams started. Not long, not loud, just a sharp yelp like a dog kicked hard, followed by a single splash. Then silence. No one stirred. No one asked. The next morning, Marin announced that Delgo, one of the top men, had fallen overboard after drinking too much rum. There was no rum. Everyone knew it. But no one spoke. Not because they believed him, because the sea had begun to feel like a mouth, yawning wider every day, and if you questioned the hand holding the rope, you might be next to slip. Elias took inventory again. This time, he counted men before food. 25. But something else was wrong now. The air had turned strange, sour in the lungs, a sickly sweet smell rising from the cargo hold. He followed it, weaving past crates and barrels that hadn't been opened in weeks. Then he found it. A wrapped canvas, stashed behind the barrels of pitch. He tugged it open. A body. Not Delgo. Someone else. Older. Long dead. Rotted black. Eyes gone. Skin clinging to bone like wet parchment. Not thrown overboard. Hidden. Buried in shadow like a secret not ready to be fed to the sea. Elias backed away slowly, bile rising in his throat. He bumped into someone. Curious? Crane, the surgeon, watching him with that same flat, distant gaze he always wore, like he never left the fog. Elias tried to speak, to ask, but Crane shook his head. "You think Marin's bad?" he whispered. "You haven't seen what men become when the meat runs out." Then he walked away. Elias stood there, cold sweat clinging to his back, because he knew now the sea wasn't the only thing that wanted to eat. 2 more days passed. The wind returned in gusts, but it didn't bring sails on the horizon, only colder mornings and hungrier faces. The sea stretched empty in every direction, flat as a sheet of tarnished silver, and the men began watching each other the way wolves watch the weakest in the pack. Marin, for his part, said nothing about the dead. He no longer held meetings, gave no speeches. He only barked orders from the helm and paced the deck like a man waiting for his own punishment to catch up. Elias noticed he no longer touched the food. He drank rainwater and chewed leaves from the lemon barrel, muttering to himself beneath his breath. Below, the stench in the cargo hold had grown worse. Elias couldn't sleep. He lay awake each night in his hammock, listening to the ship groan around him, and to the strange shuffle of bare feet just beyond the lantern's reach. Someone walking where no one should be. No words, no coughs, just steps and breathing. On the third night, he followed the sound, carefully, quietly. The path led past the hold, past the powder kegs into the narrow space near the brig where they kept broken crates and coiled rope. There, in the dark, was Marin. He stood barefoot, eyes closed, facing the wall. One hand pressed flat against the damp timber. The other held a knife. Elias didn't move. He watched. Marin whispered something, then cut his own palm slowly and smeared the blood across the wood. Not a line, not random, a shape, a jagged spiral, rough but deliberate. When he finished, he knelt. Not in prayer, in surrender. Elias backed away before the floor creaked. He couldn't make sense of it, couldn't explain it. But something on this ship was turning wrong. Not from hunger, not just. Something older. The next morning, Grady was gone. His hammock hung empty. No blood, no noise, no body. Marin made no announcement, just stood at the helm with bandaged hands and bloodshot eyes. When Crane passed Elias on deck, he didn't speak, just slipped him something small, a dried lemon peel and a bone, human, small, like a finger joint, carved with the same spiral Elias had seen on the wall. "What is this?" he whispered. Crane didn't stop walking. "Insurance," he said, "or a warning. Depends who finds it." That evening, a fight broke out near the foremast. 2 men, Jeb and Sal, arguing over a barrel of spoiled peas. No fists, just teeth. They bit each other like animals, drew blood, and neither man remembered why when they were finally dragged apart. The others didn't look away. They watched, hungrily. Elias knew then, rations weren't running low anymore. They were gone. All of them. The biscuit barrel was empty. The pork keg scraped clean. Water was a half-inch deep in the final cask. And yet no one panicked. No one ran to Marin, because somehow they believed he'd made a deal. With what, Elias didn't know, but he could feel it, like a hand tightening around the ship, a presence, not in the air or the sea, but in the wood, in the bones of the Artemis herself. And whatever deal Marin had made, it was being paid, one body at a time. The Artemis began to creak in unfamiliar ways, not from the tide or the weight of her sails, but from something deeper, more deliberate. Her timbers groaned like they were speaking, whispering, as if the ship herself had started listening to the prayers of starving men and found them amusing. By now, no one dared to call out the missing. Grady's name wasn't mentioned again, neither was Sal's, who vanished the morning after the fight, last seen hunched over the railing, mumbling at the water as if it might speak back. Crane stayed silent, but Elias caught him one afternoon standing by the main mast, one hand resting against the wood, lips moving. Not in prayer. Not quite. "Did he make a deal?" Elias asked. Crane didn't turn. "There are things older than God on these waters. And Marin? He doesn't command us anymore," Crane said. "He steers, but something else gives the orders." The sky stayed gray that day. A dull, flat, smothering gray that pressed down on the deck and refused to let up. No gulls, no wind, just the faint smell of rot beneath the boards. Stronger now, metallic and wet like old teeth in a locked jaw. That night Elias couldn't sleep. The hammocks hung nearly empty. Some men had started sleeping on the floor, backs to the walls, blades tucked under their arms. Others didn't sleep at all. They sat in the dark with open eyes, blinking only when the lanterns flickered. Elias climbed topside instead. The moon was low, the sea flat as glass. Marin stood at the wheel. He didn't speak, didn't move. His eyes were open but clouded, white around the edges like old milk, and his fingers, blistered and bleeding, gripped the wood so tightly they'd sunk into the grain. "Where are we going?" Elias asked. No response. Do you even know? Marin slowly turned his head. Not fast. Not like a man hearing something. More like a puppet on a string. To where it started, he whispered, and then softly, to feed her. Elias backed away. There was something in the way Marin stood now. Not rigid, not limp, but used. Like a candle that had burned from both ends and was now just wax melted into whatever shape the fire left behind. The next morning, the water was gone. The barrel cracked during the night. No one heard it, but it didn't matter, because by then most had stopped drinking, stopped eating, stopped kneading. They moved in silence. They watched the waves. Some knelt and whispered into the wood. Others scraped the decks with their fingers like they were looking for something beneath the grain. And every night, another hammock was empty. Elias sat alone in the hold, hands shaking, scribbling into the margins of his prayer book. Not inventory now. Not rations, just names and symbols, spirals, circles, marks he'd never learned but somehow remembered. Because something in the ship, in her, was teaching him. Not in words, in hunger, in patience, in the long, slow rhythm of starvation, and in the silence that followed every scream. He didn't know how many men remained. Maybe 12, maybe fewer. But the Artemis still moved, still sailed, and somewhere ahead, where the sky kissed the sea, was whatever Marin had promised her. Elias no longer knew if he wanted to arrive, but he knew he would, because this ship didn't lose her crew. She kept them, one way or another. The Artemis stopped needing wind. It was a quiet shift. No one spoke of it. The sails remained slack, barely stirring, yet still the ship crept forward, smooth as a dream, steady as breath. The wake behind her was thin and glassy, like she wasn't cutting the water but gliding across it. No one questioned it. They couldn't afford to. Most of the crew no longer cared about direction or time or even names. A fog had settled over their minds. Not the white, curling kind that draped over waves at dawn, but an inner fog, a soft forgetting, like something in the planks whispered, "Let go, don't remember." Elias fought it. He still wrote, when his fingers weren't trembling too badly to hold the stub of charcoal. His book of tallies was nearly full now, not of food or water, but of signs. He traced spirals over and over, trying to make sense of them. One bled into the next until the pages looked like mazes with no way out. He had begun to notice things. The wood, for one, had grown warm, not with sun, not with fire, but warm like flesh. When he pressed his hand against the boards at night, it almost pulsed, and sometimes when he shut his eyes, he thought he heard it. A low thrum, slow and steady, not the sea, not his heart, something deeper, a heartbeat. Crane still roamed freely. The surgeon seemed untouched by thirst or hunger. His eyes had gone dark and sunken, his lips pale, but he moved like a man with purpose. He never touched food, never slept, and always, he watched Marin. One morning, Elias found him in the galley, sharpening something that wasn't a knife, a bone shard filed to a point. "We'll need to cut it loose," Crane said, not looking up. "Cut what? The root." His voice was dry. "She's inside the hull now, inside us. You feel her, don't you?" Elias said nothing. Crane smiled. "You will." That afternoon they found Barrick, the youngest of the remaining crew, on the foredeck, naked, kneeling, his mouth filled with splinters, his lips torn, bloodied. He had tried to eat the wood. Marin ordered no burial, just stared at the boy's body, then looked up at the mast and nodded as if he'd just been given permission to keep going. The sea darkened that night. Not from clouds, not from storm. The water turned black. Thick and still, like ink. The sky overhead remained clear, dotted with stars, but their reflection didn't shine on the waves. The moon's silver light ended at the rail. Elias dared to touch it. The surface was slick and cold, and when he pulled his fingers back, they were smeared with something that wasn't water. It smelled like rust. The others didn't care. They sat in silence. All but one. A man named Driel began to laugh, not loudly but quietly, like something tickled inside his mind. The laughter built, curled into giggles, then screams. He threw himself overboard. No one flinched. Elias ran to the rail, but there was no splash. Only silence. The Black Sea didn't ripple, didn't react, just took him. That night, Elias heard the voice. Not Marin's, not Crane's, not anyone's. It came from below, from the hull, from the warm, pulsing timbers that breathed beneath his feet. It said one word, "Closer." And Elias knew they were. The Artemis no longer creaked, she groaned. Not from stress or storm or age, but from movement. like the bowels of something ancient had awakened, and the ship was no longer just a vessel, but a body. The boards underfoot gave gently when you walked, like stepping on muscle instead of wood. And the air? It had changed too. Thicker, damp. Each breath tasted of copper and mold, as if they were breathing through someone else's lungs. Elias tried not to sleep, not because of nightmares, but because sleep had become the most dangerous thing. You'd close your eyes and drift, and something would whisper behind your thoughts. Not words, just a presence, a hum, a low vibration that buzzed beneath your ribs like a second heartbeat trying to overwrite your own. Two men didn't wake last night. No wounds, no struggle, just gone. Still as wax, skin cold, eyes open, fixed on the beams above, mouths frozen in the half-form of a scream no one heard. Marin never came below deck anymore. He stood at the helm, lips cracked and silent, steering into the fog that had now swallowed the sea. It had no beginning, no end, just a wall of gray that drank up sound and color and time. The compass spun uselessly, the sun a distant ghost behind the mist, and yet Marin knew where to go. He didn't need the stars. He had her. Crane had taken to whispering to the rigging. Elias caught him once, fingers running along the ropes like he was petting an animal. "She's almost done changing," he said softly, not noticing Elias at first. "Can't rush the body. Has to form in pieces." "Whose body?" Elias asked. Crane smiled, crooked and soft. "Ours." That night, Elias explored the hold again. He needed to know. He needed proof that this was still real, that there were still walls and nails and timber, and not just flesh masquerading as wood. But what he found was worse. The storage crates, the ones no one had dared open in weeks, had shifted. Not moved. Shifted, like they'd softened or melted slightly, warping into bloated, rounded shapes. One pulsed faintly when he brushed it with his boot. He pulled back the lid. Inside wasn't grain or salted pork. It was skin, stretched tight over something that moved, twitched, breathed. Elias fell back, choking down a scream. That's when he heard the chanting, low and guttural, rising from the deck above. Not words, not language, just syllables that scraped across the brain like bone on metal. He climbed up in the dark, hands shaking. The crew, what was left of it, stood in a circle at the center of the deck, naked, eyes closed, mouths moving, Crane among them, Marin at the center, knife in hand, carving the spiral over and over into his own chest. The blood ran freely, and the ship shuddered. Not from waves, from pleasure. Elias fled below, heart pounding, lungs burning. He locked himself in the captain's quarters, though Marin hadn't stepped foot inside in weeks. The maps had all curled and blackened, the logs unreadable. Only one thing remained untouched on the desk, a folded page. On it, the spiral. But this time it wasn't a drawing. It was an eye, watching, blinking. And Elias realized far too late that the Artemis hadn't become a monster. She always was, and they were already inside her. The dawn broke like a thin wound across the sky, pale and uncertain. Elias pressed his palm to the warped wood of the captain's door, feeling the faint pulse beneath the surface, a heartbeat not his own, yet steady and relentless. The spiral on the folded page seemed to throb in the dim light, an eye opening and closing in rhythm with the ship's breath. He did not trust the morning. Outside, the fog clung low, a gray sea swallowing the horizon. The Artemis moaned quietly, her hull flexing like ribs inhaling deeply. Somewhere in the hold, that terrible pulse continued, slow, organic, impossible to ignore. Elias slipped the knife from his belt, fingers trembling, and pushed open the door. The quarters had changed. The wood walls curved inward subtly, closing like a ribcage. The maps hung limp, dripping faint globs of dark sap. The desk, once orderly, now seemed slick with a sheen that caught the faint light and refracted it like the inside of a shell. A whisper brushed his ear, so soft he thought he imagined it. "Come." He stepped forward, heart thudding loud enough to drown out the ship's own voice. The floor beneath him shifted ever so slightly, sending a shiver up his spine. The air smelled thick, salt and rot, and something ancient like a long-forgotten grave. From the corner, the eye on the folded page blinked again, and then it spoke, not in words, but in feeling. A flood of cold and warmth, a crushing loneliness, a hunger so vast it swallowed fear whole. Elias staggered back, clutching his chest. The door slammed shut behind him. Darkness, a breath, and then the ship sighed. She was alive, and she was hungry. Elias sank to the floor, knife forgotten, as the spiral's gaze bore into his soul. The Artemis was no longer just a ship. She was everything. and her hunger had just begun. Elias remained on the floor, the chill of the wooden planks seeping into his bones. The dim light shifted and twisted, casting strange shapes along the warped walls. The pulse, slow, relentless, throbbed beneath his feet, a dark rhythm that matched the tightening knot in his chest. The Artemis breathed around him, alive in a way no ship should be. Her timbers seemed to pulse with a secret. Her sails fluttered without wind, and the air hung heavy with the scent of salt and decay. The spiral on the folded page lay open on the desk, its eye watching, waiting. He forced himself up, trembling hands reaching for the page. As his fingers brushed the ink, a coldness crawled up his arm like the touch of something unseen. The spiral shifted, unfurling in impossible ways, revealing symbols that twisted and writhed, not meant for human eyes. Elias swallowed hard. This was no ordinary treasure map. This was a curse. A living thing. One that had claimed the Artemis long ago. The legends whispered in taverns now made a dreadful kind of sense. Tales of ghost ships, men lost to madness, and crews swallowed whole by the sea itself. And here he was, trapped aboard the very heart of that hunger. He stepped back, eyes darting to the door. It was locked tight, sealed by unseen hands. The air grew colder, the darkness thicker. Shadows stretched and clawed at the corners of his vision. Voices murmured, whispers just beyond understanding. Feed, give, drown. Elias's breath caught. The Artemis demanded sacrifice. Not of gold, not of jewels, but of flesh. The crew, once men of daring and plunder, were now husks. Shadows bound to the ship's will, wandering endless decks, their eyes empty, their bodies tethered to a fate darker than any sea. He needed to escape. But how does one flee a ship that breathes? A ship that hungers? A ship that lives? Elias's hand tightened around the knife. The night was far from over, and the true terror of piracy was only beginning. The lanterns above creaked gently on their chains, casting pale rings of light that swayed and blinked like dying stars. The captain's quarters no longer felt like a room, but a lung alive, wheezing, exhaling a foul warmth from the seams of the boards. The desk where the spiral had been drawn now rippled faintly, like water beneath a layer of skin. Elias staggered back until his shoulders met the door. His breath steamed in the air. He tried the handle again, even knowing what the answer would be. It did not turn, not even a rattle. The Artemis had him now, and she knew. From somewhere deeper in the hull, below the groaning of ropes and shifting weight, came the low moan of timbers flexing under a presence too ancient to name. It was not the voice of water or wind, it was her. The ship spoke in suffering, in hunger, in memory. And Elias, he had begun to listen. He backed away from the spiral, though it still pulsed faintly behind him, embedded now in the grain of the captain's desk, like a scar left after burning. The eye was gone, but its after-image clung to his vision, etched into the blood vessels behind his gaze. He blinked and still saw it, spinning inward, dragging him into some unseen tide. He remembered now what the old man at the docks had said before they left port. Some ships carry more than men and munitions. Some ships carry sins that never sank. He hadn't understood then. He did now. The Artemis didn't just remember the men who died aboard her. She kept them. Absorbed their desperation, drank their fear, and sealed it in the planks beneath Elias's feet. The crew wasn't gone. They were simply elsewhere. He stepped forward into the corridor again, drawn not by courage but by necessity. The ship had taken the spiral below decks. That much he could feel. Whatever its origin, whatever curse had laced itself into the ink, it was now rooted in the keel. Something older than treasure, older than sails and rigging, had found a vessel. And it fed on the lie of glory, of freedom, of the sea. The hallway beyond the captain's quarters had grown narrower, the walls curved subtly inward, and every lantern flickered as he passed. The floor was slick with brine, at least like he hoped it was brine, and every footstep echoed as if he walked within the throat of something vast. As he passed the crew's cabins, he did not call out. He knew what he would find. Doors slightly ajar, beds empty, boots and knives and journals left behind, but no men, only silence. And then, beneath the silence, breathing, from below, the lower decks, the hold, where cargo was once stored and now something else waited. He descended the steps carefully, the knife still in his hand, its edge dulled with rust, but still sharp enough to matter. The stairs groaned beneath him, as if they too resented his passage. The hold opened like a cavern, and at its center, pulsing gently in a pool of black seawater, was the spiral. not drawn, but alive. A massive floating mark, the color of stormlight and ink, spinning slowly in the water. Tendrils of red thread stretched from its edges into the beams and joists and ribs of the ship. As Elias stepped closer, the spiral responded. A deep tremor ran through the Artemis, and the shadows above twisted in approval. A voice, not sound, not words, feeling. You are the last. He wanted to scream, to run, to throw himself overboard, but the sea outside no longer obeyed the laws of distance or direction. This ship had drifted past all maps, and Elias, whether by fate or foolishness, had sailed straight into the mouth of something that no movie, no myth had ever dared tell the truth of. He gripped the knife harder. Some part of him still hoped to fight, but the spiral only pulsed, and the ship waited. There was a cold, salt-wet taste in Elias's mouth as he stepped deeper into the hold, the kind of chill that didn't come from wind or water, but from something older than either. The spiral hovered low, its edges trailing into the pooling brine, which now lapped softly against his boots. It looked like oil, but darker, thicker, and when it moved, it did so against the ship's sway, as if responding to another tide beneath the wood. Every breath he took came with effort. The air was heavy and close, filled with the scent of rotted rope, seawater, and something that smelled faintly like iron and memory. The spiral pulsed again, slow and deep, like a sleeping creature dreaming in rhythm. He stepped closer, not by choice. The water climbed over his ankles, warm and wrong. Tendrils of red thread moved just below the surface, twisting lazily like seaweed, brushing against his legs. One curled around his knee. He flinched, but it did not pull. Not yet. Elias turned slowly, searching for an exit that no longer existed. The stairs had faded behind him, swallowed into a darkness that hummed low and constant, as though the ship's bones had become a choir of whispers. The wood creaked softly overhead, not with the usual complaint of timbers at sea, but like footsteps, footsteps that never reached him. You are the last, the feeling said again, not in sound, but in that same cold weight behind his eyes. And for the first time, Elias understood it wasn't speaking of crew. It meant pilgrims. Every man who had ever boarded the Artemis in pursuit of gold or escape or fame, they'd all come chasing a myth, all lured to a ship that whispered sweet lies through rigging and sail. But what they'd entered was not a vessel. It was a mouth. And the sea was only the tongue that carried it. He looked down again. The spiral center now glowed faintly, a lightless shine that pulled the world inward. Shapes moved within it. Not images, not reflections. Memories. He saw a man fall to his knees on a beach as fire devoured a town behind him. He saw a sailor floating in a storm with his eyes open, praying without sound. A woman in tattered finery reaching for a knife as her ship broke apart on unseen rocks. All the regrets ever brought aboard. Elias saw his own face. Not as it was now, but as it had been the day he fled the gallows. Young, smiling, believing he'd escaped fate. The spiral pulsed again. The tendrils grew tighter, rising past his thighs, not dragging, not yet, but waiting. And above, the Artemis creaked once more. The voices in the timbers were clearer now, not words, but mourning, like a dirge sung by lost tongues. Elias stepped back, dragging one foot from the thick water, breath shallow. The knife in his hand felt ridiculous now, a child's toy against a god's altar. Still he held it. The spiral spoke again. Feed. Not a command, an invitation. His eyes flicked to the shadows lining the hull. Shapes moved there, half men, waterlogged and eyeless, watching. They had no skin for faces, only the ghost of memory left to wear. They were not dead, not truly, just held, just kept, like bones in the belly of something eternal. Elias screamed. Not out of fear, but out of the terrible knowledge that there would be no one left to carry the story back. No final logbook, no last confession, only the echo of a name swallowed in salt. The water surged, and Elias finally understood. Being a pirate wasn't like the stories. There was no freedom in this life, only drift, only hunger, and the lie that you would be the one to escape. The spiral opened wide. The ship exhaled and the sea waited. The water was at his waist now, warm as blood and thick with the weight of forgotten names. Elias stood trembling, the knife still in his hand, though the blade had begun to tremble with him. Not from fear alone, but from something deeper. A truth. A realization that whatever lived within the Artemis had always known he would come. That this moment wasn't a mistake. It had been waiting. The spiral floated before him, its coils slowly tightening, then unfurling again like the breath of something vast. The glowing center had begun to spin, not fast, not frantic, but inevitable, like the slow, steady rotation of a dying planet or the eye of a storm that never passed. In its center now he saw his crew, not how they died, but how they gave in. Dren, the cook, hunched over in the galley, whispering secrets to an empty pot. Maris, the quartermaster, staring into the water with glassy eyes, her hands blistered from tying ropes that no longer held anything. Even Captain Barlow, once as proud as a king, now seated in the dark, smiling faintly, lips moving without sound, as the spiral bloomed across the inside of his skull. None of them screamed. None of them fought. They had accepted. It was easier that way. Elias felt the tendrils again, soft now, no longer binding, only suggesting. They curled around his arms like a mother's touch. They wanted to soothe him. Let him rest. Let him forget. The sea offered oblivion, not agony. But Elias was not ready. He raised the knife, and for the first time the spiral shuddered. A ripple passed through the hold. The brine pulled away slightly from his skin, as though startled. The faces in the shadows turned, and the timbers groaned in protest. The Artemis moaned, a long, low sound that echoed through her ribs and rattled the lanterns overhead. The spiral had not expected resistance. Not from him, not after so many others had come willingly. Elias stepped forward, now waist deep, the knife shaking in his grip, but still held firm. "I see you," he said aloud. His voice cracked in the dark, but the words carried like fire. "You are not the sea. You are not the storm. You are a lie made of every man who died believing he was free." The spiral spun faster now, reacting. The tendrils recoiled, then surged, but not to embrace. To strike. Elias slashed the knife through the air. The blade passed cleanly through one of the red cords, and for a moment the hold screamed. The sound didn't come from his ears, but from somewhere behind his eyes, a piercing shriek of memory torn loose. The spiral twisted in agony. The shadows writhed along the hull. The water boiled at his feet, and the ship began to list. Somewhere far above, a rope snapped. Then another. The mast groaned. The sails curled in on themselves like burning parchment. The Artemis howled, not in language, but in the wild grief of a beast denied its final meal. Elias stumbled backward, knife raised, chest heaving. The spiral pulsed one final time, then began to sink. Not into the water, but into the wood. It collapsed into itself, vanishing into the very bones of the ship, leaving only a faint stain behind. The tendrils dissolved like fog at dawn. The water receded. The air grew still. Silence returned, but not peace. Elias stood alone in the empty hold, the knife now slick with dark ink, not blood. The walls no longer pulsed. The Artemis was quiet, but not dead, merely sleeping again. He had not destroyed it, only delayed it. And he knew the spiral would return. It always did. That was the nature of curses. They circled, they waited, and someone always climbed aboard. He staggered up the ladder, into the daylight, where the sky had finally cleared. But the horizon was empty, the stars unfamiliar, the compass spun wildly, and the sea, ever patient, watched. Elias emerged onto the deck, his boots echoing against damp planks as the world above swallowed him whole. The storm had passed, if it had ever been a storm at all. The sky stretched out like an old parchment, faded and wrinkled, with a strange gray light that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. There was no sun, no stars, just that same colorless ceiling, humming with distance. The sails hung limp, the rigging draped like wet cobwebs, and the Artemis drifted on a sea without movement. No breeze touched his face. No gull cried above. No other ship broke the horizon. In every direction, the water extended, flat, endless, and wrong. Not dead, but listening. Elias gripped the railing with a numb hand. His breath was shallow, not from panic, but from the slow, dawning understanding that he was somewhere else now. Not in the world he'd known. Not entirely beyond it either. The spiral had not just lived in the ship, it had carried the Artemis somewhere in return, somewhere between the living and the gone. And somehow Elias had survived the crossing. But for what? There was no crew, only their absence. Their hammocks still swayed, though untouched. Their boots remained beneath benches, their tools hung in place, but no voices, no footfalls, no laughter or curse or song. He stepped toward the quarterdeck. The wheel turned slightly, though there was no wind to move it. As he passed the captain's cabin, he paused, expecting the door to open again for the spiral to pull him back down to whisper once more. But nothing came, only silence and the ache of survival. He stared at the horizon again. It didn't shimmer with heat or dance with the curve of the earth. It stared back, flat and unnatural, as though the world had been erased beyond a few miles of sea and this single floating grave. He considered the knife still in his belt. Its blade had dulled, nicked, and stained with something that would never wash off. He held it loosely, thoughtfully. Would it be enough? If the spiral returned? If the crew returned? If the hunger came again? He didn't know. The Artemis creaked beneath him, not in pain now, but in memory. She remembered him. She had chosen him, or maybe spared him, for a reason. And Elias knew something else now. The spiral didn't destroy. It recorded. Everything. Every face, every failure, every last breath taken in the name of freedom and gold. That was why it whispered, why it offered, rather than demanded. Because it didn't feed on flesh, it fed on choices. And Elias had made his. He hadn't given in. He hadn't sunk beneath the brine. He had spoken back, held his shape, and now he would have to carry what the others couldn't. Their stories, their endings, their silence. He turned to the ship's log, resting open on the helm's bench. It hadn't been there before. Its pages were blank, crisp despite the salt air. A single quill rested across the binding, tipped in dark ink that shimmered faintly with that familiar, unnatural sheen. Elias sat and began to write. Not to escape, not for glory, but because he was still here, and someone, somewhere, might need to know what the sea does to men who think they can own it. He wrote the names of the crew first, then the captain. Then the first time he heard the spiral whisper, then the smell of the water in the hold, then the shape of the memory that lived just behind the spiral's eye. He wrote until the gray sky faded darker. He wrote as the compass stopped spinning. He wrote even when the ship began, once again, to move. Not toward home, but toward the next man who thought piracy was a story with heroes. And somewhere below, beneath the wood, the spiral stirred, waiting for the next decision. Waiting for the next meal, because the sea didn't forget, and neither did the Artemis. The quill scratched slowly over the parchment, each letter drawn like a wound. Elias wrote with hands half numb, though not from cold. The ink moved of its own accord sometimes, widening curves, thickening strokes, making the words feel older than he was, as if he weren't recording the events so much as remembering them. And that terrified him most. The logbook's pages smelled faintly of brine and wormwood. The binding was rough, and the leather had patterns scorched into it. Not designs, not runes, but fingerprints. As though others had held this very book, clutched it tightly as they bled or wept or muttered their final truths. Their stories were gone now. The ink had vanished, the pages blank when he found them. That's what the spiral did. It wiped clean. It didn't bury the past, it recycled it. But not this time. Not if Elias could hold on. He pressed his palm flat over the words he'd written so far. They were still there, still legible, still his. And the ship creaked in response, not in anger, not in hunger, but with a sound like slow recognition. He stood. The log closed on its own, gently. He took that as a sign to keep moving. The Artemis was drifting again. He hadn't raised a sail, hadn't touched the wheel, and yet the horizon, flat as hammered tin, was shifting, pulling. There was no wind, no tide, just that slow forward motion and the sound of ropes groaning gently above him. The sails, untouched, began to fill, not with breeze, but with breath. The ship breathed, and she moved. But Elias remained still. He descended the stairs again, not back to the hold, not yet, but to the crew quarters. What had once been full of noise, smoke, spilled grog, and shouts was now empty, dustless, preserved in the way a dream might be. Beds made, lockers closed, cups left on tables, as if time had paused mid-breath. He picked up a scrap of cloth, Dren's bandana, still red, still damp. Then Maris's boots lined neatly beneath her hammock, then a comb, still threaded with strands of black hair. He pocketed nothing. He was not here to scavenge. He had begun to understand now that nothing on this ship belonged to him. Not truly. Not even his memories. Not even his voice. And yet the ship allowed him to remain. Allowed him to witness. He heard a sound behind the walls. Not footsteps. Knocking. Slow. Rhythmic. Like someone trapped within the wood, tapping a single message again and again. Let me out. Let me out. Let me out. He didn't go looking for the source. He knew what it would be. Or who. The Artemis never took quickly. She waited, unraveling the mind thread by thread until the soul no longer resisted being bound. That's what the spiral did. It wasn't torture, it was erosion. And Elias wasn't eroding yet, but he could feel the edges of himself wearing smooth. The stairs to the hold were slick with condensation, no longer wet, but sweating, like the ship was exerting itself. Dreaming harder, he paused halfway down, listening. No water, no pulsing spiral, just the sound of the hull adjusting, breathing in, preparing. Whatever the Artemis had tasted in him, it had not yet consumed. It had found something different. A man who did not run, did not offer, did not belong, and that made him precious, or dangerous. He did not know which. Elias turned and made his way back to the deck. He didn't descend into the hold, not this time. He stood instead at the bow, windless hair drifting faintly though no air stirred. The sea ahead was glass, the world behind was gone. And yet, he saw something. Far in the distance, a shape, another ship, or what used to be one. Splintered masts, rotted sails, a hull more bone than board, drifting slowly, dead in the water. The Artemis was moving toward it. Elias gripped the railing, and the ship beneath him exhaled like a beast opening its mouth. A welcome, or a warning. The story was not done, and the spiral was not finished. The wreck ahead grew steadily, but without ever seeming to come closer. It lingered at the edge of perception. One moment a speck of darkness against the pale water, the next a full silhouette, broken and leaning, like a skeleton frozen mid-collapse. The Artemis drifted toward it not with urgency, but with certainty, as though returning to a place long forgotten by all but her. Elias watched from the bow, his knuckles white on the railing. There was no wind, yet the sails above him bellied with breathless tension, filled by the will of something unseen, something that did not need air to move. The spiral no longer appeared on the deck or in the hold, but its presence was everywhere. In the way the timbers creaked, in the soft hush of the water slipping past, in the pressure that wrapped around his thoughts like a net drawn tight. The Artemis was no longer alone. The second ship loomed clearer now, emerging from fog that had crept in soundlessly. Elias saw shattered beams, sails like skin pulled too tight, and rusted chains that swayed gently as though stirred by unseen hands. No name graced the hull. No lanterns burned. The prow split into the water like a knife poised above an open throat, but someone was on board. He could feel them watching. Not with malice, not even curiosity, but recognition, as if whoever remained on that ship had once stood exactly where he did now. The two vessels floated parallel, their hulls groaning in greeting or warning. A gangplank remained miraculously intact, stretching like a scar from the wreck to the Artemis, slick with brine and time. Elias did not remember it lowering. Perhaps it had always been there, waiting beneath the waves for this moment. He stepped toward it, not because he wanted to, because there was no choice. The ship wanted him to cross, not for a fight, not even for surrender, but to witness. The fog thickened. His boots met the plank with a dull thud. It bowed beneath his weight, but did not break. Water lapped softly below. Somewhere far beneath, he imagined 1,000 arms reaching up, not to pull him down, but to hold the memory of his passing. Halfway across, he paused. The silence was immense here. No birds, no creak, no heartbeat but his own. The spiral wasn't gone. It was waiting, not below decks, but on this ship. He stepped onto the splintered deck. It was colder here, not in temperature, but in memory. This ship remembered things even the sea had forgotten. Footsteps had worn grooves in the boards. Ropes had burned permanent lines into the masts. Elias passed a set of rotted boots still standing, filled with nothing. There were no bodies, only echoes. He reached what had once been the captain's quarters, now little more than a broken frame and a collapsed roof. Inside, nailed to the far wall, was a journal. Its pages fluttered faintly, though there was no breeze. Elias stepped forward and opened it. His own name was on the first line. Elias Brandt, witness, keeper, vessel. His hands trembled. The next line appeared even as he read the first. You are not the first. More writing followed, ink blooming from nowhere. And you will not be the last. He dropped the journal. It hit the floor with a wet slap. Beneath it, the boards began to blacken. And then, like ink spilling from the hull itself, the spiral began to emerge again. Not drawn, not carved, but growing, alive. It spread across the broken floor, threads twisting up the ruined timbers, curling toward Elias like vines reaching for the sun. And he knew then, this ship hadn't come to haunt him. It had come to replace him. because the spiral could not live forever on memory alone. It needed a voice, a vessel, a scribe. And he, foolish pirate that he was, had filled all three roles without knowing. He stumbled back across the plank, but the Artemis had already drifted away, by inches, then feet, then miles. She had taken what she wanted, and left him to anchor the next chapter. The spiral pulsed warmly behind him. Not hungry, but content, and somewhere in the fog, another ship stirred, and another name waited to be written. The fog thickened as if reacting to his breath, curling around Elias like cloth soaked in seawater and regret. The ruined ship behind him was no longer a place. It had become him, an extension of the spiral that now pulsed beneath his boots. The boards throbbed softly, not unlike the heartbeat of something freshly born, and the black ink of the spiral continued to spread across the floor, threading into the walls, the masts, the very marrow of the vessel. Elias didn't move. He no longer knew where movement might lead. The Artemis was gone. Not in the physical sense. It still bobbed faintly in the distance, its sails slack, its hull too pristine against the horizon, but it had left him in every way that mattered. There would be no return, no rescue, no parting wave. It had exhaled him like stale breath, and the spiral had inhaled him in turn. He turned slowly back to the journal. It now rested atop the blackened spiral, its pages open, waiting, as if it too had breath and had merely paused to let him consider the weight of the ink. A new line had appeared. You saw. You resisted. You remain. Beneath it, more words bloomed like bruises. Now you must remember for us. Elias stared, lips dry, throat raw with the salt of unspoken fear. The plank that once led back to the Artemis had dissolved into the mist. There was no way back, only forward. He sank to his knees, the spiral's edges curled lovingly around him, not as a cage, but as an embrace. A reward, perhaps, or the illusion of one. It seemed to whisper, "There is peace in the telling. There is rest in memory." But Elias knew better. Memory was not peace. It was the sea itself, endless, consuming, seductive. He pressed a palm to the deck and felt the ship's soul there. Not a spirit, but a weight of accumulated grief. This place was not cursed because of something it had done. It was cursed because of everything that had happened to it. Each man who died believing the sea would save him. Each woman whose body was fed to the tide in silence. Every secret buried beneath the waterline. And now Elias would carry them. Not by choice, but because he still drew breath. The journal glowed faintly now, and the ink inside it stirred even before his fingers touched the page. This time, he didn't write. He spoke, softly, carefully, words no one had asked to be spoken aloud. He told the story of Maris's laugh, deep and sudden. He told the story of Barlow's last toast before the storm. He told the story of the bread Dren once burned and blamed on ghosts. The spiral did not resist, it listened, and for every memory he gave, the ship grew quieter, the fog less dense. But the journal filled, line by line, without ink, without pen. It recorded him. Not just his voice, but his soul. He spoke until his breath grew hoarse, until the spiral dimmed slightly, flickering like a candle near the end of its wick. Then, silence. The ship stilled. And in the hush that followed, Elias understood the final truth. He had not been spared. He had been recruited. Because some stories were not meant to be told in taverns. Some were only meant to exist. Here, in the in-between, where sea met sorrow, where ship met memory. Where the spiral never stopped turning, and somewhere, in the fog beyond, another sailor clutched a map drawn in bad ink. Smiling, naive, headed straight into the mouth of something that did not hunger for flesh, but for the telling. The silence became his companion. Not oppressive, nor kind. It simply was, settling over Elias like salt on old timber, layering every breath, every heartbeat, with the strange pressure of remembrance. He no longer waited for wind or wave. The ruined vessel that held him did not drift. It lingered, moored not to water, but to the seams between worlds, afloat on memory's tide. The spiral had dimmed, but never vanished. It lay now beneath a thin film of brackish water pooled on the deck, pulsing faintly beneath the rippling surface like a heartbeat too weary to stop. It no longer reached for him. It had no need. He had given enough. For now. Elias sat beside the journal, which had swollen with moisture and ink. Its pages no longer fluttered. They breathed, rising and falling with rhythms he could not dictate. He no longer opened it. He no longer had to. The spiral had begun writing through him, with no hand or voice required. His thoughts, his half-dreams, his memories, taken. not stolen, preserved. The weight of it gnawed at the corners of his sanity like barnacles clinging to the hull of his soul. He felt them sometimes, scraping. He ate when he remembered to. Dried meat that hadn't spoiled, bread that never molded, water from barrels that refilled slowly, drop by drop. The ship provided in its own way. A caretaker, a prison. Both. He had tried once to cast himself into the sea, to escape the ever-tightening circle of breath and memory. But the water had not let him go. It had gone cold, not icy, but ancient, and had gently pushed him back. Not with force, but with a sad inevitability. The same way the tide returns driftwood to shore, not rejection, just unfinished business. When he woke that night, soaked, shivering, the journal opened beside him with new words already written, he did not try again, not because he had made peace, but because he knew better. The spiral did not allow endings, only continuations, only recordings, only witnesses. One night, he couldn't tell which, they had all begun to blend, he heard a sound above the creak of rope and moan of plank. A bell. Far off. Faint. A single toll, followed by silence, then another, then silence again. Elias stood. There had never been bells before. He turned slowly toward the fog, now thinner than it had been in weeks, or was it months? The ship no longer told time, it simply was, eternal and unmoving. But the fog now parted, and through it, dim as a thought half forgotten, was a glow. Not fire, not lantern, but warmth. A golden shimmer, low and wide, like the memory of a harbor from a childhood dream. It was not real, he knew this, nothing here was. And yet, he felt it, in his chest. Not hope, but recognition. The spiral behind him stirred, not angry, not fearful, but curious. The glow flickered again, and with it came the faintest shape of a sail, a vessel, small and tattered but whole, and on its deck, a figure, alone, standing exactly as Elias once had, staring out, knife at his belt, map in his hand, eyes filled with foolish bravery and the aching, beautiful lie of freedom. The spiral pulsed once, strong and slow. Elias took a breath, the journal opened, its last page blank, waiting. And he knew what he must do. He sat beside it, dipped the pen, and began to write. He is young, and he believes. The spiral curled tighter, the glow grew nearer, and the tide that remembered prepared itself once more, to welcome, to record, to begin again. Elias wrote without looking down. His hand moved steadily, though the ink no longer came from any well he could see. The words poured like sap from a tree long tapped, slow and inevitable. Each line scratched into the journal brought with it a strange weight, as though by writing this stranger's arrival, he gave the man not only existence, but fate. He had no name for the sailor yet, but the spiral would give him one. It always did. The ship drawing near, this new vessel from the golden haze, was no ordinary wreck. It was too small to be a traitor, too clean to be cursed, too hopeful to belong here. Its sails, though frayed, were taut with wind Elias could not feel. Its bow split the water as though it trusted the sea not to bite back. How rare that was. Elias remembered that faith, and how quickly it soured. The new sailor stood firm at the helm, legs wide, face unreadable in the distance. But Elias didn't need to see it, he remembered it. The tight jaw, the guarded shoulders, the map clutched like a promise. Maps were always lies. That was their purpose. They offered illusion, that the world was known, that a path could be drawn, that arrival was something you could plan, but the spiral wasn't on any map. It moved, it chose, and now it had chosen again. The journal's pages flipped slowly, though no wind stirred them. It landed on one nearly at the center, blank, but old. The parchment had yellowed, as though the entry had waited a long time to be born. Elias dipped the quill, though it had never run dry, and wrote, "He follows the stories, not for gold, but for the shape of the truth beneath them. He thinks if he finds the ship they spoke of, he'll understand what they all forgot." A line appeared beneath his words, not written by his hand. "He does not know he is already remembered." Elias froze, then set the quill down. The spiral stirred beneath the deck. The boards did not creak, they sighed, as if tired or satisfied. He walked slowly to the rail of the ruined ship and looked out once more. The golden glow was fading, replaced by the dull silver of a rising mist. The new ship was closer now, close enough that Elias could see the figure clearly. Young, tall, gaunt, a strip of cloth tied over one eye. The map in his hand was ancient, familiar, too familiar. Elias had drawn it once, not on parchment, but in words, in taverns, in whispers. Back when he still believed stories were something you owned. The spiral had never needed to chase its victims. It only needed one of them to speak. The lie would do the rest. He turned back to the journal. The ink shimmered softly, waiting, but Elias did not write again. He simply tore out the last page, folded it once, then turned to the edge of the deck and waited as the new vessel coasted in, gentle, curious, guided by a pull it did not yet understand. The sailor looked up at him. They locked eyes. Elias said nothing. He simply held out the folded page, hands steady. The sailor hesitated, then climbed the last few feet along a rope tossed between the hulls. He took the page, unfolded it, read it, and his face changed. Not with fear, but with that same quiet realization Elias once felt. This was not the beginning of a tale. It was the end of all others. The spiral had no interest in gold or gods or fame. It wanted only this, a voice, a witness, a pen that could bleed. The sailor looked up again, mouth open to speak, but Elias stepped back, into the mist, into the spiral, into forgetting. The deck swallowed him without a sound, and the journal snapped shut. The deck lay still in Elias's absence, but not silent. Wood remembered. Every nail, every knot, every splinter had known the weight of men before him. Men who thought they were steering ships, when in truth they were being drawn. Now, it was the new sailor who stood there, barely more than a silhouette in the fog-dimmed glow, the folded page still trembling in his hand. His name, he realized, had been written the moment he stepped aboard. He just hadn't known it yet. Behind him, the little ship that had brought him here had gone still. No wind stirred its sail. No ripple marked its presence. Already it was beginning to dissolve into the brume, as if it had never been whole, only lent, a dream returning to mist. He was alone, and the ruined vessel beneath his boots had begun to breathe. Soft, almost imperceptible exhalations pulsed through the hull, rising with the planks and falling again with the rhythm of something sleeping, or pretending to. The young man stepped cautiously forward, the journal calling to him, not with voice, not with command, but with familiarity. Like a story half remembered, just on the edge of the tongue, the spiral had not shown itself. Not yet, but it was here. It always was. He approached the journal slowly. Its leather was dark with age, the edges curled. Salt crystals clung to its spine, but it was warm to the touch, as though left near a hearth. He did not open it. Not yet. Instead, he looked around at the desolate ship, the torn sails swaying without wind, the ropes moving slightly like they were being plucked by invisible hands. There was no blood, no bones, no visible curse. And yet, dread pooled in the corners of the deck, gathering where shadow met silence. Then, movement. From the captain's cabin, where Elias had once stood and watched the spiral return, a faint sound echoed out, the scratch of a quill. The new sailor stepped back. Instinct. Some part of him knew better than to answer that call, but curiosity was heavier than caution now. That was how it always began. He moved to the doorway and paused. Inside, the spiral had begun writing again, without hands. Ink flowed across the journal's page, thick and slow, drawing new lines in jagged, living script. The candle beside it flickered blue, its flame bent sideways by breathless wind. He read, "Do not follow. Do not flee. You are the page now." The words shimmered once, then dried. He turned to leave, but the doorway was no longer a doorway. The deck behind him had shifted, grown taller. The railing twisted upward like bone. Masts loomed where none had been. The fog churned beneath his feet, not around the ship, but within it. The vessel was remaking itself, shaping around him. It did not want him to leave, because it needed him now. Every previous voice, Elias Maris Barlow, had filled a chapter, but the spiral was never satisfied with chapters. It wanted volumes. It wanted completion. The sailor dropped the folded page. The spiral caught it. The black tendrils crept from beneath the deck, curling around the parchment like roots around a tombstone. Slowly, reverently, they pulled it below, as if returning it to its source. The sailor looked down at his hands. They were ink-stained. He hadn't written, but the spiral had begun writing through him. Thoughts that were not his now drifted into his mind, memories he had not lived. The burning of the Artemis, the scream of the cook, the whisper of a dead compass, dreams of rats nailed to doors, of leeches writhing on chests, of names whispered over black water. He staggered back, but the deck did not give way. He was anchored now, one of the spiral's own. The journal opened again. The next page was blank, and the ink began to flow. The ink flowed like midnight oil spilled onto the page, pooling and curling with a life of its own. The sailor's breath caught in his throat as the words took shape, words that were not his, yet filled his mind with vivid images, emotions that were not his, and memories whispered through time. The spiral wrote through him, weaving a tapestry of stories, loss, and shadows that stretched across the ages. He knelt beside the journal, trembling, watching the script flow and form with a terrible elegance. The lines described places he had never been but could see clearly: the starless nights over endless waters, the creak of woods strained by the weight of secrets, the hollow eyes of those lost to the sea's cold embrace. Each word was a thread connecting him to all those who had come before, and all who would come after. His fingers brushed the ink, and it felt cold and alive, like the pulse of the ship beneath his feet. The spiral was no longer an abstract force. It was a presence, a voice, an unyielding will that bent reality around it. The deck beneath him shifted once more, the woods swelling and breathing in time with his ragged heartbeat. The sails above caught a ghostly breeze, their fabric shimmering with pale light. The rigging hummed a low, mournful tune, like the dying whisper of a sea shanty carried from forgotten lips. He closed his eyes, and the sounds filled him, soft and eerie, like the murmur of waves lapping against a shore that did not exist. The journal opened again, its pages turning with gentle inevitability to a final blank sheet. The sailor lifted the quill that had appeared beside it, its feather worn and darkened with use. His hand shook as he took it, the weight of countless stories pressing down on him. He dipped the tip into the inky well, and for a moment the world held its breath. Then, with a slow, deliberate stroke, he wrote. Not for glory, not for escape, but for survival. Each letter bled from the quill like a drop of blood, sinking into the parchment and staining it with a truth far heavier than ink. He wrote of the spiral and the sea, of the lost ships and lost souls, of the hunger that was not hunger, the hunger for stories and witness. He wrote of Elias, of the Artemis, of the boy who never came, of the endless horizon that swallowed hope. And as the words spilled from his hand, the spiral pulsed beneath him, softly, steadily, as if accepting its new chronicler. Outside, the fog began to lift, revealing a sky smeared with pale stars. The water below was still. The ship was no longer a prison, but a vessel carrying stories across the infinite dark. The sailor rose, the journal clutched tightly in one hand, the quill in the other. He looked to the horizon, where the faintest glimmer of dawn whispered. The spiral had found its voice again, and the tide was ready to carry its tale onward. But somewhere deep beneath the deck, where the spiral slept and waited, a single thread unraveled. Because stories never truly end. They only wait for the next soul bold enough or foolish enough to write them anew. And so the sea kept its secret, and the spiral turned, forever. Dawn did not break as it once had. Instead, it seeped slowly, quietly, through the mist, pale and muted like a breath held too long. The sailor stood alone on the deck, the journal heavy in his hands, its pages still damp with fresh ink that smelled of brine and old wood. The quill rested beside it, waiting patiently for the next word, the next confession, the next truth. The spiral beneath the planks pulsed faintly, less urgent now, but never silent. It was a living scar on the ship's soul, a blackened wound that throbbed with every story told, every memory absorbed, every soul ensnared. It was neither evil nor mercy. It simply was, a force as ancient as the sea itself, timeless and inevitable. The sailor traced his fingers along the leather cover, feeling the grooves pressed into it by countless hands before his own. Each indentation was a signature, a mark of those who had carried the burden of witness. Their voices whispered in the creaking of the timbers, the sighing of the rigging, the rhythm of the waves lapping at the hull. He turned his gaze outward, to the endless gray horizon where sea met sky in an unbroken line. No land awaited him, no safe harbor, only the vast unknown as it had always been. The spiral's domain was boundless, an eternal sea of stories adrift. The ship itself seemed to breathe beneath his feet, the wood flexing with a life beyond mere timber. The sails fluttered faintly, catching a phantom breeze that stirred the hairs on his arms. Somewhere in the distance, a gull's cry fractured the quiet, sharp, and fleeting, a reminder that the world beyond still spun, indifferent to the ship's cursed voyage. He opened the journal once more. The pages fluttered eagerly, beckoning him to continue. The spiral demanded it. Stories needed telling, even if no one listened but the sea and the shadows. His hand hesitated above the page, the weight of countless lives pressing down on him. What tale could he tell that had not already been whispered through the ages? What truth could he share that would not dissolve into the endless night? But silence was not an option. The spiral would not allow it. It fed on words, thrived on memory, and sustained itself with witness. Without a voice, it withered. Without stories, it died. With a slow, steady breath, he dipped the quill into the ink and began to write. He wrote of loneliness, the ache of being bound to a ship that was both home and prison, of hope deferred and dreams drowned beneath saltwater tides, of the faces he might never meet, the voices he might never hear, and the lives that flickered like candle flames against the encroaching dark. He wrote of fear, of the spiral's cold embrace, the invisible chains that bound him to the ship's cursed fate, of the moments when the fog thickened and the whispering began, voices not his own, urging him to forget, to surrender, to become part of the endless tide. He wrote of resilience, the stubborn light that refused to be snuffed out, the defiant heart that clung to memory, identity, and the fragile hope of release. The ink flowed like a river, carving new paths through the pages. The spiral pulsed stronger, as if nourished by the depth of his confession. The ship seemed to steady, the sails catching the phantom wind with renewed vigor. For a moment, the sailor imagined that the voyage might one day end, that the spiral might finally rest and the stories be laid to peace. But he knew better. Stories never truly end, they only wait. Wait for the next soul adrift on a restless sea, bold or broken enough to take up the pen, to become the voice, the witness, the keeper. And so the spiral turned, ever onward, and the ship sailed, forever into the mist. Days, weeks, or perhaps years slipped past as if swallowed by the mist itself. Time aboard the forsaken ship lost meaning, stretching and folding like the sea's restless waves. The sailor, now the keeper, moved with a measured calm born not of peace but of surrender to an unyielding fate. His eyes, once bright with hope, now carried the heavy weight of countless untold stories and the deep shadow of isolation that clings to all who walk the edge of oblivion. Each morning, pale and indistinct, found him at the helm, journal in hand. The inky pages held more than mere words. They cradled the breath of the lost, the whispers of vanished crews, and the echoes of lives consumed by the endless spiral. To read the journal was to gaze into the abyss of memory itself, to hear the faint heartbeats of those long drowned beneath the tides. The ship itself had transformed. Where once there had been splintered beams and ragged sails, now the timbers gleamed faintly under the spectral glow of dawns that never truly arrived. The spiral's ink coursed like veins beneath the deck planks, pulsing in time with the keeper's own slowing heartbeat. The vessel was no longer just a wreck. It was a sanctum of memory, a shrine to the stories the sea refused to forget. At times, the keeper thought he heard the faint strains of distant laughter, a sailor's song carried on a windless breeze, a lullaby sung by voices lost to time. The sound was both a comfort and a torment, a reminder that life had once flourished here before the spiral claimed them all. The journal called to him each night, whispering tales half-formed, begging for release from the darkness that held them captive. He would sit by the lantern's flickering light, the quill poised between his fingers, and listen to the silence pressing in around him. It was a silence thick with unspoken fears and fragile hopes. The spiral had not lessened its hold. It had merely changed its song. No longer a cruel captor demanding stories in exchange for freedom, it had become a guardian of a graveyard of voices, a keeper of the lost. And so he wrote, of battles fought beneath bloodless moons, of starless nights when the sea swallowed whole fleets without a sound, of whispered prayers offered to gods who never answered, of promises broken beneath shrouds of mist and salt. Each word etched in ink was a tether, anchoring him to the past even as the present dissolved into fog. Each story preserved was a flame flickering against the gathering darkness. But the spiral's hunger was infinite, its patience eternal. One evening, as the mist thickened to a cloak that swallowed the world, the keeper noticed a new presence. Not in the form of a ship or sailor, but a shadow, a flicker at the edge of his vision, a chill in the stagnant air. It was neither threat nor promise, but a silent witness, a reminder that the spiral was never done, that stories still waited in the depths, that the sea's memory stretched far beyond the horizon. He looked to the journal, now worn and fragile, its pages filled, but never complete. And he understood with a quiet resignation that his vigil would never end, that he was bound, not by chains, but by ink, by memory, by the endless turning of the spiral. And as the ship sailed onward through the ghostly dawn, the keeper lifted his quill once more, because some tales cannot be silenced, some voices refuse to fade, some ships sail forever, not toward land, but into the depths of remembrance itself. And the spiral turns, ever onward, evermore. The sea held its breath. No wind stirred the sails, yet the ship pressed steadily onward, gliding through a realm caught between reality and something far older, a place where the edges of time blurred, and the past and present entwined like the tendrils of the spiral itself. The keeper stood alone on the deck, the journal cradled like a sacred relic, the ink-stained quill a fragile instrument against the weight of countless voices. Beneath him, the wooden planks pulsed faintly with a slow, rhythmic heartbeat, the spiral's own pulse echoing through the ship's marrow. The ink had seeped into every fiber of the vessel, its black veins winding like roots feeding on memory and sorrow. It was a living thing, patient and eternal, a vessel for the stories that refused to sink. The fog around the ship thickened, curling like smoke, swirling with the whispers of those lost to the sea's vast embrace. The keeper heard them, not with ears, but in the spaces between his thoughts, the soft susurrus of forgotten prayers, half-remembered songs, and the sighs of lives undone. They were voices without bodies, drifting like shadows cast by a fading fire. He closed his eyes and let the silence fill him. The sea was not empty. It was full, full of ghosts, full of memories, full of the endless turning spiral. The journal called him again, its pages fluttering with eager anticipation. He opened it, fingers trembling, and saw words forming where none had been moments before. The deep remembers all. The spiral waits for the next tale. He read slowly, the ink seeming to pulse in time with his heartbeat. The words were a summons, a promise, and a warning all at once. He dipped the quill in the ink and began to write. This time, he wrote of the sea itself, not the tranquil expanse seen by those ashore, but the dark abyss beneath, the vast, unknowable deep where light did not reach, and ancient things stirred. He wrote of the currents that carried ships away from sight, the tides that swallowed entire coastlines, and the fathomless hunger that lived beyond the edge of the world. He wrote of the spiral's origin, not as a curse or a blessing, but as a guardian of memory. A keeper of stories too dangerous, too vast, or too painful for mortal minds to hold alone. It was the sea's way of preserving what would otherwise be lost to oblivion. As the quill moved across the page, the fog around the ship shifted. Shapes took form, ghostly outlines of ships long vanished, their sails torn, their hulls shattered. Crewmen appeared on the decks, shadows flickering in and out of existence, faces pale and eyes wide with silent dread or longing. The keeper did not turn away. Instead, he welcomed them as one might welcome a family long lost to time, his comrades in the endless voyage through memory and loss. The ship groaned softly, the spiral's pulse growing stronger. The ink bled slowly, spreading like tendrils across the parchment, connecting story to story, soul to soul. He wrote until the candle burned low, until the ink nearly dried, until the ship itself seemed to breathe with the stories told and yet to come. And when at last the quill rested, the keeper looked to the horizon once more. There, beyond the mist, a faint glow appeared, distant but unmistakable, a beacon in the endless gray. A new story, a new soul, a new voice waiting to be claimed by the spiral's eternal tide. The keeper smiled, bittersweet and knowing, for in this endless sea of stories he was no longer alone. The spiral was vast, and it was patient, and the ship sailed on, through fog, through time, through memory, toward whatever awaited beyond the horizon, and the ink flowed, and the spiral turned, forevermore. The glow on the horizon did not grow closer. Instead it hovered, unchanging in distance, yet deepening in hue, as if the sun itself were bleeding slowly into the mist. The keeper knew it for what it was, not a light to guide the lost, but a signal, a shimmer of intention within the spiral's endless design. It called, not with urgency, but with certainty, as if saying, "There is another." He stood at the bow now, journal closed at his side, the windless air folding soft against his skin. Behind him, the ship groaned, old wood warping like breath, ropes creaking in a rhythm that no longer matched the sea. The vessel was changing again, not visibly, not loudly, but beneath the deck, where memory ran thicker than pitch, something stirred. The spiral was not done with him. He had written faithfully, he had given ink, voice, breath. He had remembered what others had forgotten, but the spiral had never asked for stories alone. It asked for knowing, and knowing required more than ink. The keeper closed his eyes. He let his hands fall to the rail, and the old timber met his fingers with a strange warmth, almost like flesh. Beneath it, he could feel the tremor. Not violent, just a slow, pulsing pull, as if the ship were not being carried by the sea, but drawn downward, beneath the waves. The journal opened behind him, not by wind, but by will. Pages turned, too fast to be natural, until they stopped on one that was not blank. A map, but not of any coast or continent. No, it was a descent. A spiral, drawn tight in the center, wide at the edges, marked not with directions, but with names. Barlow, Elias, Maris, names scratched like epitaphs into paper, and at the very center, a name yet unwritten. His. The keeper turned, walking back to the journals, the sound of his footsteps swallowed by the hush. The ship seemed to tilt slightly underfoot, not with wave, but with weight, the center pulling, calling. He looked down into the spiral etched in ink. It was deeper now, not flat, not symbolic, but open. He could see into it, black water, a reflection of sky that was not sky, stars that shimmered beneath waves instead of above. There, beneath the deck, beneath the ship, the origin, where all stories went when they ended, where memory was kept. He reached for the journal, intending to write one last line, something final, something quiet, but the page beat like a drum beneath his fingertips, and the ink ran before his eyes. The words were not his. There is only one way down, and only witnesses return. He understood. The spiral did not simply feed, it received. And it was time. Without fear, without protest, the keeper closed the journal and cradled it to his chest. Then he stepped toward the spiral. The planks beneath him opened, not with sound, but with relief, as though they had waited too long to welcome him. He fell without falling, drifted without movement. The water did not chill him, it embraced. The spiral opened wider as he sank, black tendrils curling around his limbs, guiding him downward into the folds of stories too vast for the living. And still, he breathed. Not air, but memory. Faces passed in the dark. Hands reached out and faded. Ships sailed upside down beneath him, their hulls split with old wounds, their masts trailing seaweed and whispers. He passed through them like a shadow, until at last, stillness. A place where the spiral turned no more, not because it had ended, but because here in the deepest dark, all stories were finally silent, waiting. And there, at the bottom of the sea that was not sea, the keeper opened the journal and began again. There, in the place beneath places, the keeper opened the journal one final time. No ink, no quill, no hand to guide him. The words came nonetheless. Not from him, through him. The spiral turned within the pages now, not drawn, but living, moving, slow as thought, ancient as breath. It pulsed with a dull silver light, like the glow of stars drowned centuries ago. Around him, there was no ship, no sky, no sea. Only a vast stillness layered with memory. This was not death. It was not even dream. It was what remained. Here were the first words ever spoken to the waves. Here were the last cries of sailors who had no names. Here was laughter that had never been heard. Here was every vow whispered into salt wind and every prayer swallowed by tide. And through it all, the spiral turned. Not to consume, not to punish, but to preserve. The keeper no longer knew his own name. He did not mourn it. It had been a brief sound, useful only until now. What remained of him was something deeper, softer, closer to story than to soul. He was a breath now, a hush, a turning page in the dark, and he understood. The spiral had never been cruel. It had been lonely. For all its power, all its depth, all its vast and solemn knowing, it could not remember alone. It needed keepers, witnesses, storytellers. And it had chosen him, as it had chosen Elias, as it had chosen Maris, as it had chosen the ones before language, before ship, before ink. He held the journal open to its final page. It was not blank. It was full of everything, and it shimmered, with every shipwreck that had fed it, with every oath broken on rotted decks, with every name whispered in salt. The keeper closed the book, not with finality, but with reverence. The spiral turned once more, slow and heavy, and then grew still. Not stopped, not ended, but resting, for now. Above on the surface of the sea, the mist began to part. Far from any coast, far from any chart, a wrecked ship floated in silence. No wind, no sails, just the soft groan of aged wood and the faint shimmer of ink that clung to its planks like dew. Inside the captain's quarters, a journal lay on a table, its leather softened by time, its edges curled. It breathed faintly, waiting. And far off, beyond the horizon, a boy with a map, new ink, bold lines, bright eyes, set sail with stories in his ears and salt on his lips. The spiral did not call. It did not need to. The stories would always find their way back, because the sea does not forget, and the spiral sleeps, dreaming of voices still unwritten.